My name is Lucy, and I am 33 years old. I built my parents a $325,000 dream house so they would never have to worry about a roof over their heads or a staircase they could no longer climb. I spent 4 years stripping my own life down to the studs to pay for every nail and every cedar plank. 3 weeks ago, I pulled into the driveway and found my father trembling on the porch, while a stranger in a professional vest stood in the yard, photographing every single inch of the property. I got out of my car and my stomach dropped when I saw my father gripping the railing with white knuckles, unable to even look me in the eye. He was looking through the front door at my brother Ethan, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of legal documents and a smile I had not seen in 7 long years. My brother was selling the house I built with my own hands, and my parents were letting him do it. Before we go further, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. I would love to know your age and where you are watching from today. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to a Tuesday evening in Boise, Idaho 4 years ago, to the night I first realized my father was losing his grip. I was standing in this hallway of the drafty colonial my mother had left behind when she died. My father Douglas was struggling with a simple brass doorknob. His joints were swollen from years of labor, and his right thumb would no longer bend past a certain point. He twisted and the knob slipped. He readjusted and pulled his jaw clenched in a silent battle with a piece of hardware. It took him nearly a minute of leaning his entire forearm against the wood to get the door to turn. He walked through like nothing had happened, but I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. The house was falling apart around him, peeling at the windows and groaning in the basement, but Gerald Holloway never asked for help. He did not ask when his truck broke down on Route 9, and he did not ask when he carried my mother's casket with a torn shoulder. That was the night I understood that he did not need someone to take care of him. He needed a house that would stop fighting him. I should tell you about my brother Ethan. He is 4 years younger than me, and he was always the spark. He could make my father laugh until his shoulders shook, while I was just the responsible one who reconciled the checkbooks at 14. Ethan left 7 years ago, after a massive argument over selling this very house to fund a tech startup that never actually launched. My father sided with me back then because he was not ready to leave his memories behind. Ethan took it personally, packed a bag, and drove to Nashville. For 7 years, the calls became quarterly texts and late birthday messages. But every single time I walked through that front door, my father asked the same question: "Has your brother called you?" And every time I gave the same answer: "Not yet, Dad." He kept a photo of Ethan on the fridge pinned with a magnet from a bait shop, and he would fix the position of that photo every single day. I did not know then that Ethan's silence did not mean he had forgotten us. It meant he was waiting for an asset worth coming back for. I am a CPA, and I know how to stretch a dollar and build a plan with a long horizon. For 4 years, I cut my rent by moving into a studio with a view of a brick wall. I sold my car and bought a decade-old Civic with cash. I picked up every freelance tax client that the big firms did not want. While my friends were taking vacations to Europe, I was researching universal design and lever handles that open with a single finger. I bought 2 acres on Teller Lake and watched a contractor pour a foundation that had no steps. I designed a workshop with a woodworking bench set at a standing height, so my father would never have to bend his aching back. He was a carpenter for 41 years, and I was not going to let his knowledge rot in a nursing home TV room. I did not tell him a word about it until it was finished because I knew his pride would make him refuse a gift from his daughter. 2 months ago, I finally brought him to the lake house. He walked through the rooms in total silence, touching the grab bars that looked like towel racks, and testing the pull-out shelves in the kitchen. When we reached the workshop and he saw his old chisels and block planes hung neatly on the pegboard, he turned to me with wet eyes. "You did this?" he asked. I just nodded and felt his hand on my shoulder. For the first time in years, his hand was not shaking. It was completely still. I felt a peace I had not known since my mother passed. It lasted exactly 18 days. 18 days later, I was reviewing my father's bank statements. I do it every month for him as a courtesy. Most months are predictable, just groceries and his Medicare supplement. But that morning I stopped scrolling. There was a withdrawal for $2,800 from an ATM in downtown Nashville. My father has not crossed the county line in 10 years, let alone traveled to Tennessee. I called him immediately and asked if he had authorized a large withdrawal. He sounded confused and small. No, he said, I didn't take out any money, Lauren. I checked the account details and my heart went cold. The money had been pulled from a joint savings account my father had opened 7 years ago for emergencies, an account that still had Ethan's name on it. I called my brother for the first time in years. He picked up on the first ring, his voice warm and immediate, as if he had been sitting by the phone waiting for my call. Oh my God, he said, I was just thinking about you. How is Dad? I didn't let him steer the conversation. There is $2,800 missing from the savings account, Ethan. He didn't even skip a beat. Oh yeah, he said, Dad told me I could use it. I'm in a tough spot between things right now. I told him our father said he did not authorize it. Ethan's voice shifted, becoming softer and more condescending. He forgets things, Lauren. You know that. He's 71. Things slip. I told him I had taken our father to the doctor 3 weeks ago and his cognitive function was perfectly normal. Ethan paused, then pivoted. Look, I know this looks bad, but I'm actually coming to visit this weekend. I want to see the new house. Priorities change when you get older, you know. He sounded so sincere that it was dangerous. The next morning, I drove to the lake house to find my father on the porch. He was smiling wider than I had seen him in a decade. Ethan is coming home, he said. It will be so good to have both my kids in the same room. I sat on the porch step and watched a heron standing in the shallows. I wanted to tell him about the money and the shift in Ethan's voice, but I couldn't bring myself to break that smile. I also felt a dark, heavy thought creeping in. Was I protecting him, or was I protecting my position as the devoted daughter? If Ethan came back and was welcomed, what did that make my last 7 years of work? Saturday morning arrived, and I pulled up at 8 a.m., with a trunk full of folding chairs for the housewarming. That is when I saw the white SUV I did not recognize, and the man walking the perimeter of the property with a professional camera and a clipboard. My father was on the porch, his face pale and his hands shaking as he watched the man take photos of the foundation and the roofline. Ethan said he is a friend, my father whispered, but he won't stop taking pictures. I didn't have to get closer than 10 feet to see the header on the clipboard. Residential appraisal worksheet. I walked through the front door and saw Ethan sitting at the table with 3 documents fanned out like a hand of cards. The top one was a petition for guardianship. The second was a power of attorney. The third was a glossy brochure for a senior living facility in Nashville called Maplewood. Ethan looked up and didn't even have the grace to look guilty. We need to talk about Dad's future, he said. I told him he hadn't been part of this family for 7 years. That is why I am here now, he replied. He toured the facility and claimed it was like a hotel. He told me the man outside was just a friend. Then he said something that turned the floor under my feet to ice. I talked to Dad for over an hour last night, Ethan said. He is more open to this than you think. I went back to the porch and found my father still staring at the lake. Ethan says if I stay here, you will wear yourself out, he whispered. He says you are exhausted and doing too much, and that the best thing I can do for my little girl is to let professionals handle my care. My brother had weaponized my father's love for me to make him feel like a burden. Ethan used my father's selflessness as leverage to get him to sign away the very house I had sacrificed everything to build. I looked at the garage where my father's tools were hung, and I knew I couldn't let this lie stand. I stood in my father's kitchen staring at a stack of guardianship papers I didn't know existed until 5 minutes ago. My brother was sitting at the table like he owned the place, while guests were pulling into the driveway for a housewarming party that had just become a legal battlefield. But to understand how we got to this table, you have to understand the inventory I have been keeping for the last 6 years. I am a CPA, and if there is one thing an accountant knows, it is how to track the cost of a debt that never gets paid. Since my grandmother passed away, I have been this family's unofficial safety net. I am the one who noticed when my father Douglas started losing his grip on the family finances following his early retirement from the insurance brokerage. He stopped opening mail and started filling his days with golf and a silence that cost money he no longer had. I remember the afternoon 3 years ago when the county assessor's notice arrived. The property taxes on the old family home were 2 quarters behind. My father sat in his recliner staring at a football game while I stood in the kitchen holding the certified letter. He didn't have the funds, and my brother Ethan was already a ghost in Nashville, sending nothing but the occasional thumbs-up emoji to the group chat. So I did what I always do. I opened my checkbook. Over the last 6 years, I have written checks that would make a bank manager wince. I paid $22,000 for a new roof when the Idaho winters finally broke the old cedar shingles. I covered the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and the sudden furnace repair that died on a Tuesday night in January. Nobody ever sat me down and asked me to carry the weight. I just did it because I believed in a promise. My grandmother had been the anchor of this family, building a life from a single plot of land. In her final months, her hand thin as paper in mine, she made it clear that the house at Teller Lake was to be my inheritance. She knew I was the only one who appreciated the grain of the wood and the way the morning light hit the porch. My parents verbally ratified that agreement at her funeral, standing under a gray sky and promising that if I handled the messy legal work of the estate, the house would be my future. I turned down a senior partner track in Seattle to stay in Boise because I believed that a family's word was as solid as a foundation. While I was skipping lunches and wearing secondhand coats to fund this legacy, my sister Meredith was living a life curated for maximum impression. Meredith is 27 and has always been the undisputed center of my mother's universe. She is a marketing director who spends more on her hair and Peloton scores than I spend on rent. In our parents' living room, Meredith's trophies line the mantel, while my college graduation photo is wedged behind an expensive ceramic vase. My sharing of the family love was always whatever was left over after Meredith had taken her fill. I remember the Sunday when Meredith announced her engagement to Connor Bradley. My mother Priscilla cried actual tears, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin, while Douglas raised a glass to his baby girl. They didn't mention that I had just spent $5,000 on my father's knee surgery because his insurance had lapsed again. They didn't mention that the very table we were sitting at was only there because I had cleared the lien on the house. In the Ashford family hierarchy, I was the filler paragraph between two headliners. This lake house was supposed to be my exit from that dynamic. It was $325,000 of my life built, so my father would never have to sit in a nursing home hallway that smelled like floor wax and fear. I spent 4 years researching universal design, ensuring every lever handle opened with a single touch, so his arthritic hands wouldn't have to fight his own home. I put the deed in his name because I didn't want to hold a leash on his dignity. I trusted that being the one who shows up for every insurance call and every midnight terror would mean something when the vultures started circling. But looking at Ethan now, I realize my family stopped seeing the giving years ago. They just saw me as the help. My brother is thinner than I remember, but his voice still has that salesman polish that used to make Douglas slap the table in pride. Ethan spent the last 7 years ignoring my father's calls, but he is here today because he smelled an asset. He is standing in a house I designed using the very comfort I provided to argue that my father is too fragile to stay in it. Ethan leans back in the chair and taps the petition for guardianship. His smile is the kind that takes practice, the same one he used to get out of chores when we were kids. He tells me he toured Maplewood, and it is a great facility with a community and activities. He says he is doing this to protect me from burning out, using my own sacrifice as a weapon to suggest I am failing. It is a narrative he has been workshopping with my parents in a chat I was never invited to join. Outside, the neighborhood is arriving. I can hear the crunch of gravel and the slamming of car doors. These are the people who have watched me maintain this property for 6 years. They are the neighbors who saw me painting the shutters and weeding the garden while Ethan was chasing tech startups in Nashville. I feel the room tilting as Ethan slides a silver pen across the table toward our father. He is acting like the decision is already made, like my 4 years of labor and $300,000 are just footnotes in his strategy. But Ethan doesn't know about the audit I have been running in my head since I saw that Nashville withdrawal. He doesn't know that I have been photographing every summary sheet and archiving every bank statement for years. And he certainly doesn't know that my mother, who is currently in the living room serving lemonade to the neighbors, has been lying to me about the real start time of this very party. My family has spent 3 years running a secret group chat where they discuss my turkey being dry and my career being a convenient distraction that keeps me busy while they decide what to do with my property. They think I will sit here quietly because I always have. They think the quiet one doesn't have a script of her own. As the first guests step onto the porch, I realize that the lock on the door I didn't know was there has finally turned. I am done waiting for a seat at a table that was built with my own money, but never had a chair with my name on it. The front door swung open and the afternoon light spilled into the entryway. My father Douglas looked at the documents on the table and then at the white SUV in the driveway. He didn't look like the man who once governed an insurance brokerage with a firm handshake. He looked like a man who had just realized the game film he was watching was from the wrong season. I ignored the silver pen Ethan had slid across the table and walked past my brother toward the porch. I needed to see my father's face in the open air. The gravel crunched under my feet, and the October wind carried the scent of wood smoke and cold grass. I stood in the driveway of the house I had bled for and waited for the man who raised me to explain why a stranger with a professional camera was measuring my life. Douglas was still gripping the porch railing. His leather boots were brand new, and he was wearing a crisp flannel shirt he had likely bought with the money Ethan pulled from his savings account. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was watching the appraiser angle the camera toward the roofline I had replaced 3 winters ago. I held up my phone showing the neighborhood Instagram post that had alerted me to the sale. I didn't yell, I didn't scream. I simply asked why my house was being advertised as a seamless private cash deal. My father didn't apologize. He didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and used the exact phrase my mother Priscilla reaches for whenever the truth gets too heavy. "Don't make this weird, honey," he said. "It is just a label on a deed." It was the Ashford family lullaby, the one they sing to shut down anyone who notices the cracks in their performance. He spoke as if the $495,000 they had just accepted from a private buyer was a meteorological event beyond his control. I told him I was the one who had paid the property taxes for 6 years, and that my name was supposed to be on that title. My father exhaled through his nose the sharp, annoyed puff that used to silence entire locker rooms back when he was a head coach. "You were so busy with your deadlines, Lucy," he claimed. "We didn't want to stress you." It was the same script they had used for years. They edited me out of the conversation and then told me my absence was a courtesy. Then he delivered the hierarchical slur, the one that separates the cargo from the passengers in our family. He looked at the gleaming GMC Yukon in the driveway, and then back at me. "You are a successful professional, Lucy," he said. "You are good at adapting. You don't need this house as much as Meredith does. My sister is getting married and she needs a proper foundation." He said it with the same boardroom authority he used to wear like a second skin. In his framework, family and help are the same thing, at least when the family member is me. I stood there in the salted concrete of the driveway, realizing that my parents hadn't simply forgotten to include me. This wasn't a paperwork delay or a miscommunication. They had systematically built a version of our family that required me to be invisible for Meredith to shine. They used my face and my bio to build the restaurant of their dreams, and then they erased me from the operating agreement the moment the funding was secured. Meredith stepped onto the porch holding a glass of wine. She was smiling, the kind of smile that takes practice, the one she uses when she wants you to think she's being kind. "Look, sis, you are the talent, and I am the face," she said. "The house sold for $495,000, and it is going to fund the wedding of the century." She talked about the custom silk dresses and the 5-star resort venue, while my father nodded along as if I hadn't spent 6 months eating peanut butter sandwiches to pay for the roof over his head. My father thunked Ethan on the shoulder as my brother emerged from the house. "That is my boy," he said. Ethan had convinced them that selling my house was an act of love for me, that it would save me from burning out. They had workshopped this betrayal in a chat I wasn't in while I was kneeling on therapy mats or reconciling spreadsheets for the firm. I looked at the three of them standing on the porch of a home my grandmother had promised to me and realized I was being managed like a resource rather than consulted like a daughter. Douglas jabbed his finger into the air between us, just like he used to do during halftime speeches. "I asked you one thing, Lucy," he boomed. "Don't ruin this for us." He was telling me to stay in the hallway while they toasted their success with my stolen equity. He wanted me to wash the good plates and sit at the overflow table while he celebrated a legacy built on my back. I looked at the white SUV and the professional camera, and the man who taught me to ride a bike, who was now telling me I was worth less than my sister's wedding aesthetic. I didn't feel like a winner, and I didn't feel satisfied. I felt like someone who had just walked through a fire without checking to see what was left of her own skin. I realized then that love in my family was a performance review and I had just been given a 0. Ethan smirked and told me to relax. He said I was always so dramatic when things didn't go my way. But I wasn't acting out because of the announcement. I was taking inventory. I thought about the 2,847 messages in the chat I had just discovered. I thought about the forged signature I knew was waiting in a file somewhere. And I thought about the restrictive covenant my grandmother had described to me just before she died. My father told me that families sacrifice for each other. He said that is what responsible families do. But I was the only one on the scoreboard with a negative balance while they lived in a house I owned and drank wine I paid for. I turned away from the porch and walked toward my Civic. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a speech. I just drove home in the purple twilight of the Idaho mountains. The lock on the door I hadn't known was there had finally turned. My family thought the quiet one was done, but I was just getting ready for the audit. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw Meredith posting a photo of the house with the caption, "Building something beautiful." She didn't know that the foundation she was building her life on was about to be frozen by a court of law. I sat in my car in my father's driveway for 20 minutes before I could drive. The engine was running, the heater was on, and my hands were on the wheel at 10 and 2, just like my dad taught me when I was 16. I was staring at a crepe myrtle tree that had lost half its leaves while I tried to process the conversation on the porch. My father had used the phrase, "Don't make this weird," to describe selling the house I built with my own hands. He told me I was a successful professional and didn't need the money as much as Meredith needed a proper foundation. I felt a strange, heavy clarity, like a door I had been pushing against for years just clicked shut from the other side. 3 days later, my sister Lauren asked if I could help her 13-year-old daughter Zoe with a school project about soil erosion and plant roots. Zoe is quiet and keeps her opinions to herself, which in our family is a survival tactic. We spread poster board across her desk, and she opened her iPad to look up an image of root systems. That is when the notification slid down from the top of the screen. Real Family. It was a group chat banner I had never seen before, and beneath the title was a message from Meredith. Lucy checked the Zillow listing. "Mom, tell her the sale fell through so she doesn't stop paying the utility bill yet." I read it twice. The words didn't change. There were 14 names in that gray banner, including my mom, both of my sisters, my brother-in-law Craig, and cousins I had driven 3 hours to visit last Christmas. I was not in it. As I watched, another notification flashed above Meredith's message. It was my mother, Priscilla. She wrote, "I'll handle it. Just keep Lucy busy with work so she doesn't show up early to Thanksgiving again." Zoe saw my face before I could fix it. Her eyes went wide, and she reached for the iPad, whispering that it wasn't what it looked like. I kept my voice steady the way I do in the firm when a project budget collapses. I told her it was okay and asked her to go get the glue from the living room. While she was gone, I looked at that notification for 10 seconds. I didn't unlock the device. I didn't scroll through what I now know were 2,847 messages discussing how to manage me. I just took one photo of the locked screen with my phone. One photo of the rule I had been living under for 3 years without knowing it existed. Not Lucy. I drove home in silence, the weight of those 2 words settling into a shape I could finally measure. For 4 years, I had organized every holiday. I booked the rental tables and brined the turkey at my apartment because my mom's oven was too small for 2 dishes. I drove my grandmother to every event because no one else offered. And every single year, I told myself they were just bad at texting. I told myself Diane was busy with real estate and Lauren was a single mom. I turned my father's advice to do the right thing even when nobody notices into a cage. I opened our public family group chat, the one called Caldwell Fam, on my phone. I scrolled back 3 months and counted. 47 messages. 31 of them were mine. The rest were thumbs up emojis from Craig or a simple K from Lauren. Not a single real conversation. Every time I had asked what time the cookout started, the answer was wrong. They told me 3 p.m. when the real time was 1 p.m. They gave me a 2-hour buffer so they could set up, take family photos, and have the conversations they didn't want me in. Caldwell Fam wasn't a family chat. It was a waiting room, a decoy, where I sat and filled out forms while the actual decisions happened behind a closed door. I realized then that I was the family backup plan, the one nobody actually planned to use until they needed a cash injection. They talked about my grandmother the same way. They managed her, lied to her about event times, and tried to shut her up so she wouldn't ruin the surprise. And the surprise was always a new way to liquidate an asset I was currently maintaining. 6 months ago, Diane had called me out of nowhere asking if I had thought about signing over my share of my father's house. She said the taxes and insurance were adding up. I told her that house was all I had left of him, and I wasn't signing anything. Her voice had been calculated when she said she just thought she'd ask. Now, staring at the photo on my phone, I understood that call was workshopped in the real family chat. When I said no, they moved to the next step, selling my grandmother's lake house behind my back. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched and ran the math the way I run triage. If I stayed quiet, I would keep showing up to events 2 hours late with a turkey nobody asked for. I would keep building holidays for people who planned them without me. Diane would keep pushing on the deeds until she found a way around my signature, or she would pressure my mother to pressure my grandmother. And my grandmother, who trusts her daughter, might sign something she doesn't fully understand. If I said something, I would lose the family, or at least this version of it. The one where I am allowed to cook, but not to know. I looked at the names on the list again. My mother, my sisters, 4 cousins, and even Craig's brother, a man I have met exactly twice. They were all part of the real family. I was just the help. I didn't send the screenshot to my mother. I didn't send it to Diane. I didn't post it online or forward it to a cousin. I sent it to the one person they had been trying to keep quiet for 3 years. I typed 4 words to my grandmother, Ruth. "Can you see this?" Ruth called me 31 minutes later. There was no hello. She asked how long this had been going on. I told her 3 years and over 2,000 messages. She told me they had lied to her too, claiming I was the one who canceled Easter. My mother had been narrating a version of me to my grandmother that didn't exist, a Grace who didn't care, and chose absence on purpose. My grandmother isn't the kind of woman who fills quiet with noise. She fills it with decisions. She told me she wasn't going to cry over a group chat. Her voice was steady, but I heard the edge underneath it, the kind of anger that has already moved past shock and is building something with its hands. She told me she was going to Thanksgiving, and she was going to ask my mother the one question she should have asked 3 years ago. As I hung up, I realized that my family thought they were managing my expectations, but they were actually funding their own downfall. They were currently planning a private cash deal for a property with 5 names on the deed, including mine and my grandmother's. And none of us had signed a single page. The quiet one was done being a footnote. I opened my laptop and started searching for a real estate attorney who didn't mind working on holidays. The architecture of their betrayal was about to meet the math of my inventory. I drove away from Lauren's house that Tuesday night with the photo of the iPad screen burned into my retinas. The drive back to my apartment felt like a sequence of cold realizations. For years, I had accepted my role as the responsible one, the one who handled the heavy lifting because my parents were aging and my sister was fragile. I thought I was being a good daughter, but sitting in my silent kitchen at midnight, I understood that I had been an unpaid contractor for a family that viewed me as an outsider. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for my phone to scream at my mother or demand an explanation from Douglas. I am a professional, and I know that in a world built on performance, the person with the best records usually wins. I opened my laptop and began a forensic audit of my own life. I pulled up every bank statement, every digital receipt, and every scanned invoice I had saved over the last 6 years. I created a spreadsheet with the clinical precision I usually reserve for my high-end design clients. I started with the roof. $22,000 in 2021 when the snow load threatened to crush the old structure. I moved to the property taxes, 6 years of payments that my father ignored because he preferred to spend his insurance brokerage pension on golf club memberships and craft beer. Then came the smaller expenses, the cedar stain for the porch, the premium lever handles for the doors, the standing height workbench for the shop. As the sun began to rise over the Idaho mountains, the final number at the bottom of the column glowed in white against the screen. $114,600. That was the price of my loyalty. That was the amount I had invested in a house I was currently being barred from by a private property sign. My family didn't think I was keeping track. They called me the accountant, as an insult, a way to dismiss my personality as dry and rigid. They didn't realize that being an accountant of one's own life is the only way to ensure the debt eventually gets paid. I remembered something my grandmother had told me just before she died. Something that didn't make sense until I saw those message fragments about managing Ruth. She had mentioned a safety net she had woven into the wood of that house. On Wednesday morning, I didn't go to my design firm. I went to the office of Nathan Ferris, a real estate attorney 2 towns over. I didn't want a friend or a family connection. I wanted someone who spoke in finalized sentences and notarized truths. Nathan was a man who didn't waste time on small talk. He looked at my spreadsheet and then at the property records for Teller Lake. He spent an hour digging through the county archives while I sat in his leather chair, my hands cold but steady. When he looked up, he was holding a copy of a deed from 2018. "Your parents have been remarkably sloppy," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who had seen too many family betrayals. He explained that while the title was technically in my parents' names, my grandmother had added a restrictive covenant to the deed before she passed. It was a legal guardrail the Ashfords had completely ignored in their rush to fund Meredith's curated lifestyle. The covenant stated that the property could not be sold as a private cash deal unless the proceeds were distributed equally among all living grandchildren. There was one alternative clause: the sale could proceed if the designated caretaker of the property, named explicitly as Lucy Ann Ashford, provided written consent to the transfer. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained stone. "They sold property they didn't have the legal authority to move," I said. Nathan nodded once, a sharp, deliberate gesture. "It is a cloud on the title," he said, "a massive one. They likely found a private buyer who didn't perform a traditional title search, or they used a notary who was a personal friend to look the other way." I thought about my mother Priscilla's Sunday phone calls, the 12 minutes of talking about Meredith's new promotions and her 3-carat Tiffany solitaire. I thought about the text she sent to the real family chat telling them to keep me busy so I wouldn't show up early. They weren't protecting my time, they were protecting a fraud. They were waiting for me to finish paying the utilities for the month so the buyers could move into a house that was legally still under the weight of my grandmother's promise. Nathan asked if I wanted to call them. I remembered the Texas Stoic approach: silence is not a void, it is a weapon. "No," I said. "I want you to prepare a notice of interest. I want the buyers, the real estate agent, and my parents to find out about this when the legal hammer falls, not when I give them a chance to pivot." I authorized him to file every motion necessary to freeze the escrow funds. I walked out of his office and felt the cold November air hit my face. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a burden I was carrying for people who didn't love me. It felt like a foundation. I drove back to my apartment and checked the group chat. My mother had just posted a photo of a centerpiece for Thanksgiving. It was beautiful, expensive, and entirely performance-based. Below it, Meredith wrote, "Can't wait for our first real holiday without any drama." I looked at the folder Nathan had given me. It weighed almost nothing, but it contained the entire history of how they had chosen money over blood. My sister was planning a wedding at a 5-star resort, and my father was driving a truck that cost more than his remaining savings. They were spending the $495,000 in their heads before the ink was dry. But Meredith's rehearsal dinner was only weeks away. She had sent out invitations to everyone who made her feel safe, everyone in her closest circle. I was still on the list for the dinner, but as a non-priority guest seated at the children's table. I decided right then that I would attend. I would wear something nice, I would be quiet, and I would wait. I would let them have their champagne and their toasts. I would let them tell the neighbors that I was just a volunteer help for the family, because in 72 hours the title company would realize that the woman sitting at the back of the room was the only one whose signature could make their private cash deal a reality. The quiet one was done being a footnote. I was about to become the entire story. The drive to Whitmore Estate took 50 minutes under a sky that couldn't decide between sun and clouds. The resort was a 5-star monument to high society opulence, featuring stone columns, manicured gardens, and a fountain the size of my apartment's living room. I pulled my Civic into the lot, the cheapest vehicle among a sea of BMWs and Mercedes, and adjusted my charcoal sheath dress I had bought on clearance. I walked toward the grand ballroom carrying an envelope and a quiet decision I had made in a lawyer's office. I was 33 years old, a lead interior designer who had spent 6 years funding my parents' lives, and I was about to walk into my sister's wedding rehearsal. Inside the ballroom was staggering with 30-foot ceilings and crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across silk tablecloths. 200 guests milled around champagne flutes catching the glow, while a string quartet warmed up behind a hedge. I scanned for the seating chart displayed on an easel draped in ivory linen. Table 1 was reserved for family Douglas, Priscilla, and Garrett. My name wasn't there. I found it at the very bottom of the list. Table 14. Last on the list, closest to the kitchen doors. Beneath my name, printed in the same elegant calligraphy as every other card, were 2 words in small italics: non-priority guest. I held the linen place card between 2 fingers, feeling the weight of the heavy cream-colored stock. It reduced me to cargo, a shipping label on a spreadsheet. My mother, Priscilla, materialized at my elbow, smelling of Chanel No. 5 and champagne. She whispered that the label meant no seat at the family table and urged me not to make a fuss. She said it with the measured, airy tone she used to explain weather delays to a child. In the Ashford family, cruelty was always meteorological, regrettable, but supposedly beyond anyone's control. I took my seat at table 14. The table was covered in polyester, while the family table was draped in ivory silk. I sat between 2 strangers in their 60s who asked how I knew the bride. I held the place card steady and told them she was my sister. The silence that followed told me everything the card already had. As dinner service began, the distinction became surgical. At table 1, waiters presented seared scallops on truffle risotto and poured reserved Cabernet. At my table, a young, uncomfortable waiter set down a plate of dry, unadorned chicken breast and a carafe of water. The menu card propped against the centerpiece actually read, "Non-priority dining selection." Across the room, Meredith was radiant in a $12,000 designer gown, the exact amount of the venue deposit I had unknowingly funded through years of contributions to my parents' savings. She leaned against her fiancé Connor, looking untouchable. I watched my father Douglas raise his glass in a toast. He looked proud, thumping Garrett on the shoulder, rocking on his heels like a man who had conquered something. Nobody checked on me. Nobody wondered why the bride's sister was eating economy chicken while the family ate lobster. Halfway through the course, Meredith's mother-in-law, Helen Bradley, approached the family table. She was a silver-haired woman, with the kind of posture that suggested decades of knowing exactly who she was. She glanced at me at table 14 and then back at my mother. I saw her jaw tighten by a fraction. She leaned in and asked my mother what I did for a living. Before I could even put down my fork to answer, Priscilla interrupted with a bright, practiced laugh. Lucy helps out with the family chores, she said, gesturing toward me with a wine glass. She's our reliable little volunteer. The words landed like a closed fist. I am a lead interior designer with a doctorate of physical therapy equivalent in my own field's professional standing. I had just spent 6 years maintaining their assets, paying $22,000 for a roof and another $15,000 for my father's surgery. But in this room, my family wasn't just stealing my money, they were erasing my professional identity to keep Meredith looking like the only high achiever. Priscilla's tone was sweet enough to sound loving, but firm enough to shut me down. She told Helen that I simply preferred quieter settings. I looked at my mother's diamond brooch catching the light from the chandelier. I thought about the $114,000 I had invested in a house they had sold behind my back. I thought about the 2,847 messages in the real family chat where they laughed about my dry turkey and coordinated my exclusion. They assumed I would sit there quietly. They assumed I would absorb the shame of being the help in a room full of people I had essentially paid to host. I reached into my handbag and touched the craft paper envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000, my emergency fund money I had saved by skipping every small pleasure for half a year. I had planned to give it to Meredith as a gift to show my heart was bigger than my paycheck. But as I watched my sister giggle over custom silk and my mother rewrite my life story to a stranger, something shifted. It wasn't anger, it was the clinical clarity of a professional realizing a contract had been breached. I stood up from table 14. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I walked toward the gift table, which was draped in white satin and stacked with boxes wrapped in silver and gold. I found my envelope, immediately plain craft paper among all that shimmer. I picked it up, slid out the certified check, and folded it twice into my jacket pocket. Priscilla's heels clicked sharp on the marble floor as she rushed toward me, her fingers closed around my wrist in a hiss. "What are you doing?" she whispered. I looked at her hand, then her face, and then I reached into my bag and pulled out the linen place card. I set it on the gift table where the envelope had been. "Since I am just a courtesy guest," I said. "So is this." I turned and walked toward the ballroom doors, my shoulders back and my heels steady on the marble. No running and no tears. Behind me, the ballroom went quiet as 200 guests looked at the empty chair at table 14. I walked out into the cool October air that smelled of wood smoke and cold grass. I got into my car and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I saw Meredith in her cathedral-length gown running onto the gravel path, her face flushed and her veil askew. She was screaming my name, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own breathing. I was done being the backup plan for a family that didn't even recognize my name on a signature line. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the only person who knew the true value of that property, my lawyer. The 72-hour clock had just started ticking. I sat in the silence of my car for 11 minutes, watching the dashboard clock flicker as the frost began to form on the edges of the windshield. The high society lights of the Whitmore estate were a blur in my rearview mirror, but the cold realization of what my family had done was sharp and clinical. I had just walked out of a wedding rehearsal where I was cargo, but I was driving toward a legal reality where I was the only person with the power to stop a felony. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was Nathan Ferris. "Lucy, we have a development," he said, his voice carrying that notarized quality that offers no room for misinterpretation. "The buyers of the Teller Lake property have realized the title isn't clean. They are filing for a quiet title action to scrub your grandmother's restrictive covenant from the deed." I leaned my head against the steering wheel, my hands numb against the leather. I had spent 4 years researching universal design and pouring $114,600 into that house so my father would never have to live in a place that smelled of floor wax and fear. And now the very people I tried to protect were hiring lawyers to erase the legal guardrails that guaranteed my future. Nathan continued, his tone dropping into a professional register that sounded like a countdown. "Because your parents proceeded with a private cash deal based on a fraudulent claim of sole ownership, the sale is technically voidable. However, the escrow funds are scheduled to be released in 72 hours. My sources indicate your sister's fiancé Connor has already suggested an offshore account to move the money once it hits your father's checking. If that money leaves the country, your investment and your grandmother's legacy are gone forever. 72 hours. The deadline sat in my chest like a stone. I had 3 days to decide if I would file an injunction to freeze the funds. If I acted, I would effectively bankrupt Meredith's wedding and expose my father to a criminal fraud referral. If I didn't, I would be homeless within 2 months because I had stripped my own savings to the studs to pay for their roof. I opened the real family group chat, the one with the 14 names and the 2,847 messages I wasn't supposed to see. A new photo had just been posted. It was my mother, Priscilla, and Meredith clinking crystal flutes in the bridal suite. The caption read, "Everything is finally coming together. No more drama, just our family's bright future." They were drinking champagne funded by the theft of my primary residence's equity. Below the photo, my brother Ethan had posted a thumbs-up emoji with the comment, "Glad the accountant finally left. Now the real party can start." The Ashford family motto has always been about smoothing the surface and never checking what is underneath. My mother views life as a curated campaign headquarters, where every photo is staged for maximum impression. She didn't hate me. She simply edited me out of the script because my reality was too expensive for her aesthetic. She had spent the last 3 years narrating a version of me to my grandmother that didn't exist, a Lucy who was too busy with work to care, a Lucy who preferred to be alone. I scrolled through the messages, my thumb hovering over the Leave Group button. I saw a thread from 2 weeks ago. Douglas had expressed a moment of hesitation. "Are we sure Lucy won't check the county records?" Meredith's reply was immediate and cold. "She'll sit there quietly. She always does. She's too worried about the promise she made to Grandma to ever cause a scene." They had weaponized my integrity and used my father's selflessness as leverage to keep me in the hallway while they liquidated the house I designed. I thought about the 11 times I had made the 4-hour drive to wash their good plates and listened to my father talk about Garrett's sales quotas. I thought about the moleskin notebook my Aunt June had shown me, where my mother had once written down every child I helped learn to walk, only for my father to introduce me as a hospital volunteer to guests. The architecture of their betrayal was consistent. They wanted my hands to do the work and my bank account to absorb the cost, but they didn't want my name on the invitation or the deed. Nathan's voice came back through the speaker. "Lucy, 72 hours is permission, not a punishment. It is permission to stop waiting for them to choose you. You've spent 8 years holding a safety net for people who are currently using it to strangle your career. The quiet title hearing is on Monday. If we don't file the injunction by Friday at 5, the law will assume you've waived your rights to the covenant." I looked at the non-priority guest place card sitting on my passenger seat. It was printed on linen cardstock with elegant calligraphy, impeccable presentation for a demotion. My family knew how to make cruelty look expensive. For 31 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into the spaces they built for me. I had turned my father's advice into a cage, doing the right thing while they planned my funeral from the group chat. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the resort lot. The 72-hour window was closing, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was acting out of jealousy or sibling rivalry. I felt the clinical clarity of a professional auditor. My parents had told me they could only afford one dream, and they had chosen Meredith's wedding over my home. They had assumed I would absorb the loss silently because I always did. I dialed Nathan back. "File it," I said, my voice steady enough to be a finalized sentence. "File the injunction, the fraud report, and the emergency petition for the quiet title intervention." Nathan didn't ask if I was sure. He simply said he would have the documents ready for my signature by morning. As I drove toward the highway, my phone buzzed with a text from Meredith in the Caldwell fam chat. "Hope you're enjoying your quiet night, Lucy. We'll save you a slice of cake from the brunch tomorrow." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The clock was ticking, and the version of me that still bent to their will was gone. I was 33 years old, and I was about to walk through a door I had built myself. The countdown had started, and the only thing my family would find in their real family chat by Monday morning was the sound of a legal hammer falling on their stolen dreams. I scheduled the meeting for a Thursday afternoon at a small cafe downtown, a place with exposed brick and mismatched chairs that felt far removed from the polished trauma of the Whitmore estate. I chose neutral ground because I knew that in my mother's house, I was just a pair of hands to be managed. I arrived 10 minutes early with a manila folder resting against my hip, the weight of the pages inside feeling like the only solid thing in a world that had turned to vapor. I had already authorized Nathan Ferris to file the fraud report and the emergency injunction, but I needed to look my father in the eye one last time. I wanted to know if there was a single ounce of honesty left in the man who had taught me to sandwood with the grain. My father Douglas arrived first, wearing his weekend jacket and looking at the welcome mat as if it owed him an explanation. My mother Priscilla followed closely behind her eyes, red-rimmed and damp, already launching into a full performance of maternal grief. Meredith was noticeably absent, likely busy with another high-stakes meeting about floral arrangements or silk chiffon. We sat at a corner table, the air smelling of roasted coffee and the faint metallic tang of the first Idaho frost. Priscilla reached across the table and squeezed my hand with a touch that felt rehearsed. She told me they loved me, and that families forgive because that is what they do. I pulled my hand back and didn't rush to accept the sentiment. I sat with the silence until Douglas cleared his throat, the sound of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders but was now struggling to find a script. I looked at him and asked one simple question: "How much did you sell Grandma's house for?" The table went quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a room from the floor up. My father ran his thumb along the rim of his cup, his eyes avoiding mine. "It was a difficult market, Lucy," he said, his voice carrying that sandpaper quality of a man building a bridge out of excuses. He told me the house had only sold for $200,000 and that after the remaining mortgage and the fees, there was nothing left for me. He looked at me and said he was just trying to protect the family from more stress. It was a lie delivered with the same boardroom authority he had used to introduce me as a volunteer help for the last 3 years. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice because I have learned that volume doesn't make people listen, but clarity does. I reached into my bag and placed a printed copy of the closing disclosure on the table, right between the sugar bowl and the salt shaker. The number $495,000 was highlighted in yellow. The room went airless, like someone had opened a window in reverse. Douglas's face went the color of old concrete, and his hand froze on the table. Priscilla's performative tears began on cue. She gripped her napkin with both hands and told me I was being cold and calculated. "We're family, Lucy, not a bank," she cried. She argued that Meredith needed that money for her future, for the foundation of her new marriage, and that I was being ungrateful for everything they had done for me. She used the same words I had seen in the real family chat, claiming that I always made everything about money because I didn't have a life of my own. I stood up slowly, the way you stand when you want people to hear the chair move. I looked at my mother, who was watching the story she had told herself for months fall apart in real time. "I'm not the bank," I said, my voice as steady as a clinical diagnosis. "I'm the owner of the restrictive covenant you just violated. I'm the person who paid $22,000 for a roof while you were planning a $12,000 wedding party on my birthday." My father tried one last audible, jabbing his finger into the air the way he used to do in the locker room. He told me I was ruining their lives and that I was the reason the neighbors were starting to ask questions. But I didn't feel triumph. I felt a dull ache for a father I realized I never truly had, and a mother who was only now learning that the pedestal she built for one daughter left the others standing in the cold. They had spent 8 years treating my generosity as an obligation and my silence as consent. I left the manila folder on the table, a paper trail of every lie they had told and every dollar they had stolen. I told them that from this point forward, every conversation would happen through Nathan Ferris. My mother's face collapsed into something raw, the mask of the devoted matriarch finally shattered beyond repair. She asked if I really wanted to lose my family, but I told her they had already decided to lose me the day they forged my expectations into a cash-out deal. As I walked toward the door, the bell chimed with a sound that felt like a hinge turning. I could see them through the window. Two people who had spent their whole lives managing a performance, now sitting in the wreckage of a script they could no longer control. I drove home in the purple twilight of the Boise Hills, feeling the clean, quiet relief of someone who has finally put down a bag that was never theirs to carry. My family thought they could wait me out, but they didn't realize that being the quiet one for 31 years had given me the perfect vantage point to watch them build their own prison. The 72-hour clock was down to its final rotations, and the next time my father's name appeared on a document, it wouldn't be on a fake deed, it would be on a court summons for elder financial exploitation. I wasn't just an accountant of numbers anymore. I was the architect of the only truth that mattered. The bell above the cafe door chimed one last time as I stepped out into the biting Idaho air, leaving my parents sitting in the wreckage of their own lies. The drive back to my apartment was performed in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. But for the first time in 8 years, the tension wasn't from holding things together, it was the quiet of finally letting go. I woke up the next morning to 47 unread messages and 12 missed calls, a digital avalanche that signaled the end of the Ashford family's curated performance. My mother Priscilla didn't waste time, and she didn't call to apologize. Instead, she went to work on the only skill she truly mastered: information extraction and narrative control. By noon, an email had been blasted to the entire extended family, from Aunt Susan in Florida to cousins I hadn't seen since my father's retirement party. The subject line was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive concern: prayers for Lucy. In it, my mother painted a portrait of a daughter who had suffered a psychological breakdown due to the pressure of her high-stakes design career. She wrote that I had become unstable, that I was suffering from delusions regarding Grandma's estate, and most devastatingly, that I was acting out of a toxic jealousy toward Meredith's upcoming happiness. She didn't mention the $495,000 or the forged covenant. She simply edited me into the role of the family villain, a family-adjacent member who was related to them by proximity but no longer belonged at the table. The voicemails began shortly after the email hit. 87 messages in 72 hours. I listened to every single one, not because I was seeking pain, but because I was an accountant of facts, and these recordings were the final audit of my family's character. I sat at my kitchen table with a lined notebook, the same kind I used to track client revisions and site measurements, and methodically summarized each call. Message number 7 was from my father Douglas. His voice carried that sharp jabbing register he used when a play went wrong on the field. He told me I was destroying the family over a few dollars and that I needed to learn my place. He didn't ask how I was sleeping or if I was okay after the cafe confrontation. He was just checking the inventory of my compliance. Message number 28 arrived at 2 a.m. from Meredith. The sweetness she used for her Instagram followers was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged volume that made the speaker on my phone crackle. "How dare you do this to me?" she screamed, her voice ragged with the fear of a woman watching her Emerald Valentino dreams evaporate. She told me I was a selfish, cold-hearted accountant who had never understood what it meant to love a family. She said I was a charity case they had tolerated for years, and that she couldn't wait to split the house money, so she never had to see my sad, quiet face again. By the second day, the cousins started chiming in. People who had sat at the Thanksgiving tables I organized, eating the turkey I brined, and the sweet potatoes I made from my mother's recipes, were now sending stiff, distant texts. They asked if everything was okay with my health, and suggested I seek professional help before I did anything else I would regret. My mother had successfully rewritten me as the person who ruined the mood rather than the person who was being robbed. I sat in my one-bedroom apartment, the space feeling warmer and lighter. The more I realized I was no longer the safety net for people who didn't value me. I looked at the non-priority guest place card sitting next to my notebook. The Ashfords always knew how to make cruelty look expensive, and this email campaign was just another high-end production designed to keep the truth in the margins. But while they were performatively grieving my instability in the group chat, I was watching the real architecture of our family collapse. I received a text from Simone, the wedding planner, who had seen my mother's public posts and felt a professional obligation to reach out. She told me that Meredith was spiraling, calling vendors and demanding they lower their prices because the investment funds were being delayed. The house I had built was being used as a credit line for a wedding that was currently 6 figures underwater. I ignored a call from Aunt Susan, knowing it would just be another layer of the Ashford lullaby telling me to fold for the sake of the family. Instead, I opened my laptop and checked the county recorder's site one last time. The quiet title action was still pending, but my notice of interest was now a matter of public record. Anyone who searched the property would see my name, the real one, not the forged signature my father thought he could hide behind. The hardest part wasn't the exclusion. It was the clarity of realizing that my share of the family love was never actually given. It was a transaction I had been funding with my own silence. I had spent 33 years waiting for a seat at their table, only to find out that the table was built on a foundation of my stolen equity. I finished the entry for voicemail 87, closed the notebook, and set it inside the manila folder Nathan Ferris had given me. It was a complete case file, Andler versus Andler. I felt no guilt and no anger, only the clinical exhaustion of someone who had finished a long, grueling audit. The world didn't end because I stopped being convenient. My parents had told me I would have no family left if I pushed back, but as I looked at the silver ornaments catching the Idaho sun on my shelf, I realized that a family built on forgery isn't a family at all. It's just a debt that has finally come due. The 72-hour legal window was narrowing, and the next time the phone rang, it wouldn't be a relative with a script. It would be Deputy Martinez, and he wouldn't be looking for a seat at the table. He would be looking for the people who thought they could sell a legacy without the caretaker's consent. I turned off my phone, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in my life, I let the silence be enough. The real family was about to find out that when you write someone out of your story, you lose the person who was making the story possible. My mother's email was the first shot, but my response was already filed at the courthouse, and it carried the weight of every dollar and every hour they thought I'd forgotten to count. I woke up on December 24th, and the air in my apartment was still and cold. Outside, the first real snow of the Idaho winter was beginning to fall, turning the Boise Hills into a landscape of white and gray. For 34 years, Christmas Eve meant the Ashford house on Oak Lane, the smell of my mother's ham, and the annual performance of family perfection. But this year, the only thing waiting for me was a phone call from Nathan Ferris. The court had granted the emergency injunction. The legal hammer was mid-swing, and the timing was a clinical accident of a crowded court docket that didn't schedule around holidays. 40 miles away, my family was gathered at the house I had housing them in for free for 2 years. They were preparing for Meredith's final wedding dress fitting and an early holiday dinner. I could picture the scene without being there. My mother Priscilla would be in the kitchen arranging expensive hors d'oeuvres on grandmother's good china pieces she had claimed years ago without asking. My father Douglas would be in his new leather recliner, nursing a craft beer and telling anyone who would listen how the real estate market was finally working in his favor. They were drinking wine and laughing inside walls I paid for, decorated with the confidence of people who believed they had successfully edited me out of my own life. They didn't know that my real signature, the one with the smooth downstroke they could never replicate, had already signed the authorization for the sheriff's department to move. At 4:58 p.m., the sun dropped behind the tree line, and the sky turned that bruised purple you only see in late December. In my father's driveway, the new $80,000 GMC Yukon sat under the string lights he had mounted along the gutters. Inside, Meredith was likely radiant in her emerald Valentino, while her bridesmaids linked arms and raised champagne glasses to a future funded by my stolen equity. The real family chat was probably buzzing with photos of their perfect evening captioned with emojis of hearts and diamonds. Then came the knock. 3 firm, unmistakable raps on the front door that didn't sound like a neighbor or a caroler. It was the sound of judicial authority. When Douglas opened the door, the warm air from the party hit the cold Idaho night like a wall. Deputy Martinez stood on the porch, his uniform dark against the falling snow, flanked by a partner and a representative from the county escrow office. I wasn't in the room to see my father's face drain of color, but I knew the exact shade of old parchment it would turn. I knew how his shoulders, usually square with the posture of a man used to giving orders, would drop as the deputy handed him the emergency enforcement order. The room behind him went airless. I could see the shapes in the dining room in my mind, people frozen mid-motion serving spoons suspended over turkey platters, children looking at the door with wide eyes as the music stopped and the silence rang. Deputy Martinez spoke in that clear, practiced tone of someone who has performed this ritual hundreds of times. He informed my father that the court had issued an injunction related to documented financial fraud involving the Teller Lake property. Then came the second blow. Because the GMC Yukon had been identified as a purchase made with the initial deposit funds from the fraudulent sale, it was being seized immediately as a proceeds of fraud asset. The scene must have been a wreckage of their curated aesthetic. While my mother clutched her Chanel brooch and Meredith screamed that this was her wedding night, the sheriff was handing over a notice that the family bank accounts, the ones holding the $495,000 they thought was theirs, were frozen. I sat in my dark apartment, 40 miles away, watching the snow accumulate on my windowsill, next to my grandmother's glass butterflies. I felt a long exhale that fogged the glass. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I thought would come with a $5 million check being torn to pieces in front of a dining room full of strangers. I just felt done. Setting a boundary isn't revenge. It's the moment you decide that you exist and that you matter. But in our family, when you tell someone no for the first time, after a lifetime of yes, they don't hear a boundary. They hear a malfunction that needs to be fixed. My mother's text arrived on my phone screen, up glowing in the dark. If you do this, you'll have no family left. Is that what you want? I looked at the message and realized my family had already decided to lose me the day they forged my name on a loan document and split the money 3 ways. They had chosen a luxury wedding and a new truck over a daughter who had spent 6 years being their safety net. I didn't owe them a warning because my Sunday dinner was never a conversation. It was a script they had written without me. I watched the headlights of a car sweep across my ceiling as a neighbor pulled into their driveway. They would be going inside to a warm house and a normal holiday. My family was currently standing on a porch in the snow, watching their stolen status symbols be towed away while 23 guests looked on in disbelief. Uncle Tom, my father's older brother, would be the one to step forward and ask if it was true. Aunt Susan would be the one to remove her arm from my mother's shoulder and reach for her coat. The architecture of their lives was collapsing because I had stopped providing the invisible structural support. I had spent 8 years furnishing the hallway of a family that had no room for me inside. Boundaries don't feel like victory. They feel like standing on a cliff you built yourself, watching the bridge behind you burn, and knowing you are the one who lit the match. I turned off my phone. I didn't want to hear the 87th voicemail or the screaming at 2 a.m. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like space. The new year was starting, and for the first time in my professional life, my CPA license was protected, and my name was my own again. I leaned back and closed my eyes, listening to the quiet of a house that finally belonged to me and nobody else. The legal hammer had fallen, but the real work, the work of seeing patterns and finding the right table, was only just beginning. I spent the week after Christmas in a state of suspended animation, moving through my apartment like a ghost in a house I no longer recognized as home. The silence following the sheriff's arrival at the Oak Lane house was heavy, and absolute, a thick wool blanket pulled over the remains of my family life. I kept my phone in a kitchen drawer, checking it only once a day to forward the rising tide of vitriol and bargaining voicemails to my attorney. I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. Instead, I felt the clinical exhaustion of a professional who has spent years balancing a ledger only to realize the entire business was built on a fraudulent foundation. On a gray Tuesday morning in early January, Nathan Ferris called me into his office for a discovery review. The city of Boise was trapped in a deep freeze, the sky the color of old concrete matching the mood inside the leather-bound chairs of his conference room. Nathan didn't start with the bank statements or the frozen escrow files. He set a laptop on the table and looked at me with an expression that carried no professional cushioning. "We uncovered something during the subpoena of the real estate agency's digital archives," he said. "Standard practice for high-value private cash deals often involves recorded lines for compliance." He pressed a button and the room filled with a voice I had known since the day I shared a nursery with it. It was my sister Meredith. The recording was dated 3 weeks before the housewarming party. In it, Meredith sounded crisp and performative, the voice she used when managing marketing clients or charming potential investors. She was speaking to the lead agent, a man named Nolan Voss. "I've workshopped the price with my parents," Meredith said. "They are on board with the private sale. I just need to ensure the closing happens before the first of the month." Nolan's voice was cautious. "And your sister, the co-owner, I assume she's been briefed on the restrictive covenant." Meredith's laugh through the speaker was sharp and dismissive, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Don't worry about Lucy," she said. "My sister is slow. She doesn't understand spreadsheets or complex asset architecture. She'll believe whatever my mom tells her about the price. Just get the cash into my personal account before the wedding. She's essentially a courtesy invite to her own life. Handle the paperwork so her signature isn't a bottleneck." The recording ended with a soft click. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the hum of the office furnace. I sat motionless, staring at my own hands on the table. For 34 years, I had believed that Meredith's favoritism was a byproduct of her personality, that she was just the spark, and I was just the reliable one. I had spent my entire life trying to prove I was worthy of a seat at their table, only to hear my own sister call me slow to a stranger so she could steal my grandmother's legacy. It wasn't just a bad day for the family or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was architecture. They had built a life that required me to be a victim so they could be perfect. They needed me to be the one who stayed in the margins, the one who didn't understand the math, so they could spend my share of the supply without guilt. They had narrating a version of me that didn't exist to ensure I never asked the right questions. Nathan slid a manila folder across the table containing the transcript of the call. "This is evidence of conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud and elder financial exploitation," he said quietly. "Your sister wasn't just being greedy, Lucy. She was actively coaching a third party to bypass your legal rights." I thought about the 2,847 messages in the Real Family chat. I thought about the 12-minute phone calls from my mother, where 11 minutes were dedicated to Meredith's promotions. It was all part of the same production. My mother had been the director, Douglas had been the silent enabler, and Meredith had been the lead performer, while I was the unpaid staff member who was never allowed to see the script. I walked out of Nathan's office and into the biting Idaho wind. The cold didn't bother me anymore. It felt honest. I drove to a park near my firm and sat on a bench under a sycamore tree that had lost every leaf to the frost. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't wondering if I had overreacted. I wasn't listening to the Ashford lullaby telling me to keep the peace. I pulled out my phone and did something I had never done. I opened the group chat, the Caldwell fam decoy chat, and I posted the audio file Nathan had just given me. No message, no accusation, no explanation. Just the sound of Meredith Bishop explaining exactly how she intended to erase me. The read receipts appeared almost instantly. Craig, Lauren, Douglas, Priscilla. 4 names, 4 people who had spent 3 years managing me into silence. For 10 minutes, the chat was still. Then the phone began to vibrate in my hand, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that felt like a trapped insect. Douglas called first. I let it ring. Priscilla texted the words scrambled and panicked. "Lucy, honey, that's not what she meant. It was out of context. Please don't do this to us." I read it and felt nothing but the clean, quiet relief of a professional who has finally closed a book they were finished reading. Then came the message from Garrett. He hadn't texted in months, but the audio file had clearly reached the outer branches of the family tree. "Is this true?" he asked in a private thread. "Did she actually say you wouldn't understand the spreadsheets?" I replied with one sentence. I understand the spreadsheets well enough to know that $47,000 of my money was spent on a dress for a woman who thinks I'm a courtesy invite. I turned off the phone and watched a dog run across the frozen grass chasing a ball. It was ordinary and uncomplicated, and for the first time in 34 years, I realized that I didn't have to earn my seat at any table. My worth wasn't a performance review conducted by a mother who only loved one daughter. I stood up, smoothed my coat, and walked back to my car. The bridge was burning behind me, and I was the one who had lit the match, but the air on the cliff was the first fresh breath I had taken in a decade. My family thought the quiet one was a bottleneck to their cash-out deal. They were about to find out that when the safety net lets go, the entire structure falls with it. The 72-hour legal window had transitioned into an open investigation, and the only person who still had a clean record in the Ashford family was the one they had edited out of the story. I was done being the backup plan. I was finally the architect, and I was building a life that had no room for people who only saw me as a resource to be managed. I spent the remainder of January avoiding the digital wreckage of my family's group chats. After I posted that recording of Meredith calling me slow and a courtesy invite, the Ashford family dynamic didn't just crack, it imploded. My mother Priscilla left frantic messages about context and misunderstanding, but I had spent enough years in high-stakes design to know that when the foundation is rotten, no amount of fresh paint can save the structure. I went back to my firm burying myself in floor plans and material boards, trying to pretend that my name wasn't currently the primary evidence in a fraud investigation. On a Tuesday afternoon, my receptionist buzzed me with a tone of voice that usually meant a high-profile client had arrived unannounced. "A woman is here to see you, Lucy. A Mrs. Bradley." I set down my measuring tape, my pulse quickening. Helen Bradley Meredith's soon-to-be mother-in-law was a woman whose posture suggested decades of high society navigation and a refusal to suffer fools. When I opened my office door, she was standing by a sample display of Italian marble, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes sharp as a surgeon's. "I'm not here to take sides." "Waverly," she said, using the same measured southern warmth I had heard at the rehearsal dinner. "But my son Connor is a man of integrity, and he's been hearing two different versions of a story that involve a lot of money and your grandmother's house." I invited her to sit and did what I do for every client who needs to see the structural truth. I laid out the math. I showed her the spreadsheet of my $114,000 in property investments. I showed her the restrictive covenant on the deed. Finally, I played the recording of Meredith instructing the real estate agent to bypass my signature because I was too slow to understand spreadsheets. Helen didn't interrupt. She watched the data with a stillness that was more terrifying than any of my father's halftime rants. When the audio ended, she didn't look at me. She looked at her own hands, which were folded over a leather handbag that likely cost more than my first car. "Your sister told us the house was a gift from your parents to her," Helen said quietly. "She told us you were too busy with your career to care about the family legacy." I realized then that Meredith hadn't just stolen my equity, she had used my professional success as a justification for her theft. She had painted me as the greedy, distant daughter to make herself look like the devoted golden child. Helen stood up, her expression shifting from curiosity to a livid, clinical coldness. "Thank you for the truth, sweetheart," she said. "I raised my boy to value honesty, and if your sister lied about something this straightforward, I worry about what else she is hiding in those spreadsheets she thinks you don't understand." The fallout happened 5 days later at the Ashford family's traditional Sunday dinner. I wasn't invited naturally. I was still the non-priority guest, the one they hoped would stay in the margins while the Bradley money cleared the escrow. But I heard the details later from Simone, the wedding planner, who received a frantic call from the venue within the hour. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration of the final wedding headcount. The Bradleys arrived on time, but instead of bringing the customary bottle of expensive wine, they brought a manila folder. Halfway through the main course, a roast chicken my mother had likely boasted about seasoning herself, Helen Bradley stood up. The room went airless, the kind of quiet that fills a house when the people inside realize the script has been rewritten without them. Helen didn't yell. She spoke with a firm handshake quality in her voice that commanded the entire dining room. She told my parents that the Bradleys were officially withdrawing their support for the wedding. She looked directly at Meredith and said, "If a woman treats her own sister like surplus inventory, it raises questions about how she will treat a marriage." She mentioned the house, the forgery, and the recording. She told my father, Douglas, that she had no interest in being family adjacent to a group of people who used their own child as a credit line. Connor stood up beside his mother. He didn't look at Meredith. He looked at the door. The Bradleys walked out of the Oak Lane house with the same deliberate speed they had used to enter it. They left my parents sitting at a table full of food that nobody was eating anymore in a house that was currently being seized as a proceeds of fraud asset. The wedding was canceled by Monday morning. But the tragedy wasn't just a lost engagement. Because Meredith had insisted on the 5-star treatment, she had signed contracts for the venue, the catering, and the designer gown in her own name, assuming the house sale would cover the balance. With the escrow funds frozen by my injunction and the Bradleys gone, Meredith was suddenly the sole owner of a $100,000 bill for a party that would never happen. My mother called me at 2 p.m. on Monday. Her voice was thin and ragged, stripped of the usual production quality she used for family announcements. "You destroyed your sister's life, Lucy," she sobbed. "She lost her fiancé. She's going to be in debt for a decade. Are you happy now?" I sat at my desk looking at the Counselor of the Year plaque I had moved from the hallway to my own wall. "I didn't destroy anything, Mom," I said, my voice steady as an audit summary. "I stopped protecting a secret that was never mine to carry. Meredith didn't lose her life because of me. She lost it because she bet $495,000 on a lie and expected me to be the one to pay the interest." Priscilla didn't hang up this time. She just breathed into the phone, the sound of a woman realizing that the daughter who always folded had finally run out of reasons to come back. The silence between us had a texture now thick and heavy, like a wool blanket. The legal battle over the house was entering its final phase, and Meredith was now facing the first of many collection calls from the Whitmore estate. My family had spent 3 decades writing me into the margins, but as I hung up the phone, I realized that I was the only one left in the Ashford family with a clean credit score and a future that wasn't mortgaged to a performance. The golden child was drowning in her own luxury, and the quiet one was finally learning to breathe. I opened my email and found a message from the county district attorney. They had finished reviewing the recording. The next conflict wouldn't be a dinner table argument, it would be a courtroom deposition. My parents had told me they could only afford one dream, and now they were about to find out exactly how much their nightmare was going to cost. 6 months have passed since the night the Bradleys walked out of the Oak Lane house, and the high society wedding of the century dissolved into a pile of collection notices and frozen accounts. I am sitting in my modest, 1-bedroom apartment in Boise, the kind of space that finally feels like a safe perimeter. The Idaho summer is fading into a sharp September, and for the first time in 8 years, my phone doesn't ring with a family crisis that requires a cash injection. I have spent these months rebuilding my professional standing and watching the fallout of the Ashford family's curated perfection seep into the local grapevine like a slow-moving poison. A knock at the door interrupts my Tuesday evening. It is not the firm, authoritative rap of a sheriff or the rhythmic tapping of a neighbor. It is a hesitant, wobbly sound. When I open the door, I find my parents, Douglas and Priscilla, standing on my welcome mat. They look 10 years older than the last time I saw them at the Neutral Cafe downtown. My father's weekend jacket is wrinkled, his silver hair is unkempt, and my mother's eyes are red-rimmed with a type of exhaustion that drugstore makeup cannot hide. "Can we come in?" Douglas asks. His voice is rough and stripped of the boardroom authority he used to wear like a second skin. I don't step aside. I lean against the doorframe, keeping my hands in my pockets to hide the way they want to shake out of habit. "Say what you came to say," I tell them. I have learned that invitations in this family are usually just Trojan horses for management. Douglas is holding a manila folder against his chest, the same way he used to hold his football playbook when a game was falling apart. He tells me the bank has foreclosed on the Oak Lane house. They used the equity as collateral for a restaurant loan they gave Meredith to save her failing marketing firm, But without the private cash deal from Grandma's house, the interest rates devoured their remaining savings. The lifeboat they thought was coming sank at my kitchen table. They have 30 days to vacate a property they have lived in for 31 years. My mother reaches into the folder and pulls out a letter. It is titled an apology, but as I scan the handwritten pages, I realize it is actually a list of reasons wearing an apology's clothes. She acknowledges that things were hard and that they were overwhelmed by Meredith's promotion that turned out to be a lie. She says they were trying to protect the family from more stress. It is a narrative designed to reframe their fraud as a noble sacrifice. Douglas clears his throat and makes the pitch. "I'll fix the paperwork, Lucy," he says. "I'll go to the county clerk and amend the settlement. I'll give you 50% of whatever is left after the foreclosure sale. Whatever you want, just come back and help us navigate the bank. We're family." The words land like a number that doesn't balance. I look at the man who used to introduce me as a volunteer and realize he isn't offering 50% because he finally sees my worth as a daughter or a professional. He is offering it because the quiet title intervention I filed with Nathan Ferris has frozen the entire estate. Without my signature on a formal settlement agreement, they have 0%. I am the only one who can unlock the cage they built around themselves. I look at Priscilla, who is watching me with that performative grief I once mistook for love. She tells me I am destroying the family over money and asks if this makes me feel powerful. But I don't feel powerful. I feel the clean, quiet relief of someone who has finally put down a bag they were never supposed to carry. My father tells me he's still my father and that I owe him respect. He reminds me of the promise I made to my grandmother. But respect is built, and they spent every cent of mine years ago. I think about the 2,847 messages in the real family chat discussing how to manage the accountant while she paid their medical bills and taxes. "You're not offering me a seat at the table, Dad," I say. "You're offering me a commission on my own theft." I watch his chin drop a fraction of an inch. I tell them I won't sign a settlement that includes an offshore exit for Meredith or a payout for their truck. I tell my mother to stop telling me to keep the peace because peace built on me swallowing what is wrong is just silence. I reach for the manila folder and take out the court order Nathan Ferris prepared for this exact moment. It is an individual accounting of every dollar I invested in the Teller Lake house. $114,600. I tell them I will sign the release only when my investment is paid back in full from the sale proceeds and the rest goes directly to the foundation Grandma Eleanor loved. The silence that follows is thick and heavy. My father's jaw works, but no words come out. He looks at the folder in his hands and then at the modest hallway of my apartment. He realizes that when I stopped letting him control me, his entire structure collapsed. He is a 61-year-old man alone in the wreckage of a script he can no longer control. My mother starts to cry, the real kind of crying that doesn't ask for permission. I let it sit there. I don't rush to comfort her or feed her the right words. I tell them the door isn't locked, but I won't sit at a table where I'm a courtesy invite to my own life. I close the door gently, the way you close something you don't plan to open again. I hear their footsteps on the stairs, slow and diminished. I walk back to my kitchen and finish making dinner. The house is quiet, but it's my kind of quiet. The golden child is facing a reality that doesn't match her Instagram captions, and the quiet one is finally holding the deed to her own future. The reversal is complete, and for the first time in 34 years, the math finally balances. The following Monday, I sat down with my financial advisor, Patricia, a woman who had been telling me for 3 years that my family obligations were eating my retirement. I didn't need the numbers to speak anymore. I needed them to stop. I authorized her to cancel every automatic payment linked to my parents' accounts, effective immediately. The spreadsheet filled the screen. 6 years of property taxes, medical bills, insurance premiums, and the sudden cash injections for Meredith's emergencies. The total was staggering, but I didn't feel the usual weight of resentment. I felt the clean, quiet relief of someone who had finally installed guardrails after seeing what happens when the road has none. I kept a short list of rules on an index card taped inside my kitchen cabinet, where nobody could see it but me. Rule 1. I do not lend money to family. If I choose to give it, is a gift with no expectation of return, and if I cannot afford to give it away, I do not write the check. Rule 2. I do not respond to guilt as a negotiation tactic. If someone tells me I am selfish for having boundaries, that is simply confirmation that the boundary is necessary. These weren't punishments or walls built from anger. They were doors. And for the first time in 34 years, I was the one choosing who walked through them. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice stripped of the usual production quality. She started to talk about the difficult season our family was going through and used that familiar melodic plea to keep the peace. I stopped her mid-sentence. I told her that peace built on me swallowing what is wrong isn't peace, it's just silence. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me, it had to be built on respect, not on what I could provide for them financially. She cried quietly, without the theatrical edge I was used to, and for the first time I let her sit with her own discomfort, instead of rushing to fix it. In late October, the settlement from the fraud case finally cleared. I used the recovered funds to do something my parents never expected. I didn't move to Seattle or buy a flashy car. I contacted the original buyers of the Teller Lake house. Their quiet title action had stalled because of the restrictive covenant, and the legal nightmare I had unleashed made the property a liability they were eager to shed. I bought back my grandmother's house with the same clinical precision I use for high-end design contracts. When I walked up the ramp and pressed the lever handle, the door opened without resistance. It felt like returning home because it was. I decided to host my own celebration on September 14th, my birthday. The invitation wasn't a gold foil production. It was a simple text to the people who had actually seen me when I was invisible. I called it my birthday and housewarming, 2 words I had never put together without my sister's name attached. The guest list was small, but for the first time in 34 years, every person at that table was there because they chose to be. Lee, my best friend since college, arrived first with a bottle of wine and the same flannel jacket she's had for a decade. Then came Aunt June carrying a small black moleskin notebook like it was a sacred text. She squeezed my hand at the door, her eyes holding an apology and a pride that didn't need words. Finally, Helen Bradley pulled into the driveway. She walked onto the porch with a gift wrapped in cream stationery and a smile that reached her eyes. We didn't sit at a long mahogany table with crystal chandeliers. We sat on the wraparound porch at a wooden table my grandfather had sanded smooth decades ago. The air smelled of pine and the cold Idaho lake. There was no photo booth, no flirty 30 neon signs, and no 3-tier cake with only one name on it. Bryn had brought a simple cake with white buttercream and 3 words written in blue frosting, "Just Lucy finally." Zoe sat next to me, her hair in a braid and her school project diagram propped against the railing. She looked at the lake and said it was beautiful here, echoing exactly what my grandmother used to say. We talked about normal things, school projects, the base jumping near the dock, and whether the porch needed a new coat of stain before the first snow. We didn't talk about the real family chat or the 2,847 reasons I was never told the truth. The silence between us felt clean, not loaded. Midway through the evening, Helen Bradley stood up and raised her glass. She didn't give a rehearsed toast about family pedigrees or corporate achievements. She looked at me and said, "Family isn't a label on a place card, dear. It is how you treat people when no one is ranking them." Everyone at the table raised their glass. For the first time in my life, I was in the middle of the frame, not standing at the edge, not cropped, and not a footnote. I realized then that I had spent half my life raising my parents and the other half waiting for them to see me. I had been carrying a compass that pointed toward people who weren't walking toward me. I had finally set that compass down and looked in a different direction. This part of my life, the third part, was mine. I didn't get revenge. I got a table where nobody was missing because everyone who mattered was already there. As the sun began to set over Teller Lake, turning the water to copper, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from the family group chat, the actual table, the one I had created for me, Zoe, and Grandma Ruth. It was a photo of the three of us from earlier in the afternoon, laughing at something the heron had done. I smiled, saved the photo, and set the phone face down on the table. The quiet was a boundary solid and clear, and I didn't owe anyone an apology for building it. I looked at the three women sitting with me and felt the strange emptiness of the past 8 years finally being filled with something real. I was Lucy Ann Ashford. I was 34 years old, and I was nobody's backup plan. But just as I felt the last knot of the old life loosen, Aunt June leaned in and whispered, "There is something else in the back of the notebook, Lucy. Something your grandmother saved for the day you finally came back to this house." I took the moleskin notebook from Aunt June with both hands, the way you hold something fragile that has already survived more than it should have. We were sitting on the porch of the lake house I had spent 4 years building, the same house my parents thought they could sell to fund a life I wasn't invited to. The guest list for my housewarming was small, but every person there, Lee, Aunt June, Helen Bradley, and my niece Zoe, was someone who had seen me when I was invisible. The sun was setting over the Idaho mountains, casting long diagonal lines of gold across the cedar railing I had sanded smooth. I opened the notebook to the very back past the lists of children I had helped walk, and the milestones my mother had recorded before she died. Tucked into a hidden pocket in the rear cover was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, yellowed at the edges and bearing a distinctive red wax seal. My hands began to tremble. This wasn't a client invoice or a floor plan adjustment. It was a document dated 6 years ago, signed in the final months of my grandmother's life. I called Nathan Ferris immediately and pressed the speaker icon. The ring filled the porch, a sound that silences everything, the last murmur, the last held breath. "Nathan, I found something," I said. I read the header of the document aloud: voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and conditional adoption. The line went so quiet, I checked to see if the call had dropped. Nathan's voice, when it finally came, was stripped of its usual professional cushioning. "Lucy," he whispered, "bring that to my office right now." The next morning, the boardrooms and courtrooms of Boise became the stage for a reversal that no one in the Ashford family saw coming. Nathan had spent the night cross-referencing the document with the county's archived tax filings from a decade ago. He sat across from me, his expression carrying that clinical clarity that offers no room for doubt. He explained that years ago my parents Douglas and Priscilla had signed a series of legal forms relinquishing their caretaker duties to me for my grandmother. They had done it to avoid the high cost of elder care insurance and to claim a specific tax status that allowed them to shield their own assets. They thought it was just a business decision, just paperwork to manage the situation. They didn't realize that Grandma Eleanor had seen the storm before I did. She had taken those relinquishment forms and used them as the foundation for a Clause 7 addition to her real will, the one my father didn't know existed. Because my parents had legally stated they were no longer responsible for her care, Eleanor had formally and legally adopted me as her successor and legal daughter for all purposes related to her estate. This meant that as far as the law was concerned, Douglas and Priscilla Myers had stopped being the heirs to the Teller Lake property the moment they signed that tax shield document 15 years ago. They were third parties, legal strangers to the property they had just sold for $495,000. The realization landed in my chest like a stone. They didn't just try to sell my house. They had sold property they never legally owned. By claiming sole ownership on the private cash deal disclosure, they hadn't just committed a family betrayal, they had committed grand larceny and felony mortgage fraud. The legal hammer didn't just fall. It detonated the entire Ashford empire. Nathan Ferris coordinated with the county district attorney that afternoon. Because the initial deposit funds had been used to purchase the GMC Yukon and fund Meredith's 5-star wedding venue, the authorities were now tracking the money with surgical precision. I sat in Nathan's office and watched the digital ledger of their downfall. The wire transfers were flagged as proceeds of fraud. The private buyer of the lake house, a man who thought he was getting a seamless deal, filed a civil lawsuit against my father within 48 hours. The escrow funds were frozen permanently. My sister Meredith called me at 2 a.m. Her voice ragged with the fear of a woman who has finally realized the question she was most afraid of has arrived. She didn't call me slow this time. She didn't talk about spreadsheets or her closest circle. She screamed that the bank had seized her wedding dress and that the Whitmore estate was threatening to sue her for breach of contract. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the silence in my apartment between her ragged breaths. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt the clean, quiet relief of a professional who has finally put down a bag that was never theirs to carry. I told her the same thing I had told my mother. Peace built on me, swallowing what is wrong, isn't peace. It's just silence. The next morning, my father was taken into custody at the county courthouse. The local paper, the same one that had run a front-page photo of him as Coach Dixon 5 years ago, now carried a headline about elder financial exploitation and grand larceny. He was facing 3 to 7 years in state prison. My mother was named as an accessory after the fact for her role in the mail forwarding and narrative control. In small towns like ours, a Thanksgiving implosion doesn't stay inside the house. It rides home in every car. By the end of the week, everyone in Millfield knew the real story. The parents who had spent decades building a reputation as pillars of the community were now eating lunch alone. The women who had sat with my mother at Bible study for 20 years stopped saving her a seat. I drove past the Oak Lane house one last time. The furniture was gone and the garden I had weeded for 6 years was overgrown. My parents were living with Aunt Susan while they waited for their sentencing hearings. The real family group chat had dissolved, its 14 members scattering like dry leaves in an Idaho wind. The surprising payoff wasn't the money I recovered or the house I bought back. It was the moment I walked into the county registrar's office and signed my name on the new deed, not as a daughter or a safety net, but as the sole owner. My signature had a smooth downstroke that nobody in my family could replicate, and for the first time in 34 years, it was exactly where it belonged. I was no longer a footnote in their book. I was the one holding the pen. The quiet one had finished her audit, and the only thing left on the scoreboard was the truth. It is 5:45 a.m. on a Saturday in late July, and the air over Teller Lake is so still it feels like held breath. I am sitting on the porch of the house I spent 4 years designing and 6 years funding, a house that is finally legally and spiritually my own. The Idaho mountains are silhouettes of jagged ink against a sky that is just beginning to bleed into a pale violet. In my hands, I am holding a small hand-carved bird made of cherry wood. My father Douglas made it for me when I was 6 years old, back when he was just a man with a wood shop. And I was just a girl who liked the smell of cedar shavings. It is the only thing I kept from the room he converted into a man cave years ago, effectively erasing the last physical evidence of my childhood to make space for his own leisure. I do not feel a surge of triumph as the first light touches the water. I do not feel the heat of revenge or the sharp satisfaction of seeing the people who hurt me face the consequences of their own choices. What I feel is the absence of noise. For 8 years, my head was a factory floor of constant calculations, a perpetual audit of how much more I could give to earn a seat at a table that was already being sold behind my back. That noise is gone now. The clinical hum of anxiety has been replaced by the quiet of a house that opens without resistance. The legal battle over the Clause 7 reveal was swift and devastating. Once the district attorney saw the documentation of the conditional adoption and the fraudulent signatures on the private cash deal, the Ashford family performance didn't just end, it was deconstructed. My father is currently performing community service at a state park, picking up litter along a nature trail while he waits for the final terms of his suspended sentence. My mother Priscilla is living with Aunt Susan, her reputation as a devoted matriarch and pillar of the community replaced by the scarlet letter of a criminal record that does not wash out in a small town. The social fallout walked right out their front door and rode home in every guest's car. By the time the news of the grand larceny indictment hit the local papers, My parents were fielding questions in church fellowship halls that they could not answer. People they had known for 30 years began to rearrange themselves around the truth, moving away from the performance and toward the evidence. I am now 34 years old and the director of sustainable development at my firm. My supervisor offered me the promotion over a cup of coffee, casual and clean, because my numbers were strong and my client retention was the best in the department. A year ago, that milestone would have been met with a family invoice, a broken water heater at my parents' house, a tax bill for my father, or a sudden emergency for Meredith. Now the only person who benefits from my 60-hour weeks is me. I look at my phone sitting on the porch table. It is silent. There are no 2 a.m. screams from Meredith and no 12-minute narrations from my mother about my sister's manufactured success. I open the Real Family group chat one last time. I scroll past the 2,847 messages where they workshopped the price of my life and coordinated my exclusion. I see the photos of the champagne toasts at the stolen house and the comments about the accountant being a courtesy invite to her own future. I do not type a final speech. I do not send a message of forgiveness or a parting shot of anger. I simply hit the button that says Leave Group. The gray banner vanishes from my screen, and the 14 names that thought they could manage my expectations are gone. I turn off the device and set it face down on the cedar wood. The sun finally breaks over the peaks, turning the lake into a sheet of hammered gold. I think about the photograph from Christmas 1998 that I still keep in a cloth-bound album. In it, I am 8 years old with 2 braids sitting on my father's lap while my mother reaches for the camera timer. That family might have existed once, or perhaps it was just a 4x6 glossy version of who we wanted to be. The real version was always taking shape underneath the favoritism and the slow calibration of who gave and who took. My father judged worth by performance and my mother judged it by appearance. My grandmother Eleanor judged it by character and kindness. And now I finally get to judge my own worth by my own standard and my own truth. I am no longer waiting for approval from people who will never give it because their love was always a performance they couldn't afford. Setting a boundary was not a betrayal. It was survival. I spent a decade writing checks and swallowing my frustration, believing that love meant never asking for fairness. I thought that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family. It took losing the house I designed to realize that the people who take from you without gratitude will never stop on their own because you have taught them that taking is free. My mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway is empty, except for an electric bill and a postcard from Aunt June, who is currently on a fishing trip in the Poconos. Everything in it is addressed to me and delivered to my house. Nobody has rerouted it, nobody has intercepted it, and nobody is reading my bank statements at a kitchen table 40 miles away to calculate how much more they can take. I stand up and walk to the edge of the porch, the hand-carved cherrywood bird still in my palm. It is fragile, just like the girl I used to be, but the wood is solid. I look out at the lake and feel the warmth of the Idaho sun on my face. I have a house that is quiet and a name that is clean. I have a future that is not mortgaged to a performance and a seat at a table where nobody is missing because everyone who matters is already here. The quiet is a choice and it is mine. I am Lucy Ann Ashford. I am 34 years old. I am an architect of my own life and a lead designer of my own peace. I am not a backup plan. I am not a footnote, and I am not a courtesy invite. I am finally fully center frame. Thank you for being here with me. If this story made you realize that your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it, I want you to hear this. Setting a boundary is not an ending. It is the beginning of your real story. Leave the wrong table and find the right one. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story about someone who refused to stay silent. I'll see you at the next table. Until then, take care of your peace. I sit on the wraparound porch of the lake house, watching the Idaho sun dip behind the peaks of the Sawtooth Mountains, casting long golden shadows across the cedar planks I once stained with my own hands. The air is finally still, devoid of the frantic digital pings and the heavy manufactured expectations that defined my life for 34 years. In my lap lies the cherrywood bird my father carved decades ago, a solitary remnant of a childhood that was eventually mortgaged for my sister's aesthetic. I don't feel the heat of a victor. I feel the cool, clean relief of a woman who has finally finished a grueling audit of her own soul and found that the numbers finally balance. Looking back at the wreckage of the real family group chat and the legal fallout that followed the Clause 7 reveal, I've realized that my grandmother didn't just leave me a house, she left me a blueprint for survival. Here are the 5 lessons I'm carrying with me into this new quiet chapter. Boundaries are not betrayals, they are survival. I spent years believing that love meant absorbing every cost and swallowing every lie to keep the peace, only to realize that peace built on my silence was just a slow-motion disappearance. Being the reliable one is often a trap designed by those who want to take for free. My family didn't see my hard work as a gift. They saw it as a baseline obligation that made me a courtesy invite to my own life. The accountant's mindset is a superpower, not a slur. They mocked my need for spreadsheets and facts, but it was that very precision that allowed me to spot the architecture of their betrayal and protect the legacy they tried to steal. Mercy is a choice, not an obligation. I chose a legal settlement that protected my investment rather than seeking absolute destruction, proving that my character was never determined by their mistreatment of me. You don't need to earn a seat at the right table. I spent decades trying to fit into a seat that was being sold behind my back, only to find that the actual table is small, honest, and already has my name on it. The golden child has lost her stolen pedestal, and my parents are learning the cost of a script built on forgery. I am no longer a backup plan or a footnote in someone else's marketing campaign. I am Lucy Ann Ashford, the architect of my own peace, sitting in a house that opens without resistance to the people who truly see me. Thank you for walking this gravel path with me. If you've ever been the one left out of the group chat or the one expected to pay for a party you weren't invited to, I hope my story reminds you that your worth is not a performance review. For more stories about finding the courage to stand up and speak your truth, subscribe and stay tuned to Hazel Tells Stories. Your real life is waiting for you to stop being quiet.